Well, thank you for joining us for the next episode of the HR and CQ show. Typically, we've been doing these shows with just myself and Sarah, and this is the first time that we've actually had the privilege of having a guest join us. So today's guest is, it's a bit of a hero to me. This is David Livermore, our guest. He is the director of the CQ Fellows. He has been researching cultural intelligence for the last 20 years. So it's a real privilege to have you on the show today, David.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Sarah. I didn't know I'm the first guest.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
exciting.
See, you've had two inaugural things in one day.
I
Because
have.
those who are following us will know that we bounced just off of this morning's event. So you're shooting for the stars with us today.
Absolutely.
So obviously Sarah and I have been talking about HR and cultural intelligence for the last few episodes. But for those that may be tuning in for the first time with the fact that we've got you as our guest on the show, maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about your work and just give us a brief introduction to cultural intelligence.
Yeah, so as you know, Emma, I've been researching and working in the space of cultural intelligence for about 25 years. And really what gave birth to the work was just a curiosity around how do you help those of us who travel widely but not deeply, as I sometimes say. That is, when you're moving in and out of a lot of different cultures. So maybe we don't have the prerogative of being an expert at all those different cultures, but still know we need to have something that informs it. So that really led to the emergence of us researching this notion of cultural intelligence, which certainly anyone who listens to you regularly is familiar with because you talk about it so often. But cultural intelligence we define as the capability to relate and work effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. And the simple way that I like to often say it is cultural intelligence helps you get along with anyone, anywhere.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
That's good. We need that.
It's definitely something that's needed in Dubai though, right? Because there's just so many different nationalities and cultures here in the region that I think if you're coming into the region for the first time, whether that's because you've relocated or whether that's because you're coming here on project through your existing employer that are based somewhere else, you're going to be interacting with so many different cultures that, you can't expect the workplace to look the same or sound the same as it does when, we're back home.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few companies that do where they sort of open a satellite office over here and they try and replicate it. But as you know, from your experience, that just doesn't work. And in Dubai, I mean, we've got probably the most diverse population globally, with the highest number of not just nationalities but nuanced cultures within those nationalities. And something else that's coming more and more prevalent now is people who are almost multi-nationality based because they are Indian by birth, for example, or British by birth and passport, but they actually grew up in Dubai. And that then brings a whole element of differentiation on their cultural behaviors as well. What are some of the tips that you could, kind of think about people approaching coming to this type of environment? What kind of research or what kind of expectations could they have?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'd be interested in the perspective both of you have. In some ways, I sometimes find it's harder to get people in places like Dubai, Singapore, London, New York, to appreciate the importance of cultural intelligence because it is already so cosmopolitan. So sometimes the thought is like, just everybody's in an urban environment. Do I really need it? And I think that's where it catches you off guard, especially a place like Dubai where someone has probably rightfully heard that less than 10% of the workforce are actually Emiratis. Well, then I'm good. And yet, you know way better than I do with the years that you've both been here that Emirati culture still has a profound impact on what happens in the workplace, as well as the city and the Emirate as a whole. So yeah, more specifically to your question, Sarah, I would say a tip and one of the things that we measure in cultural intelligence is drive, which really is curiosity and openness. So do I come in to the new environment with a sense of curiosity, or with a sense of judgment of like, oh, I heard about this in Dubai and here we go, and oh, superficial this, or, the rigid rules here, et cetera. So curiosity goes a long way, and we will probably get into it. There's certainly more to cultural intelligence than that, but if I could only pick one tip I was going to give someone, I feel like that would be the one I would say is come in with an openness to discover, like, why is it that things operate that way here?
I think that's really important. I know I see a lot on social media of people who believe that the streets are paved with gold and every ice cube has a diamond in it and things like this, and are sorely disappointed when they get here and realise that it's not, but also think that they're going to work in a British company, for example, and therefore it's going to be the same as in the UK. Well, no, because the person who's managing you might be British by passport, but their cultural behaviour has changed and adapted and morphed to accommodate the lifestyle, the rules, regulations in the UAE, and that needs to be transposed to individuals.
Yeah, and I think just this, I don't know whether it's disrespectful to say this delusional approach of, I'm so good at my job, that's why I've been sourced or headhunted to come to Dubai.
And sometimes they're right. Like that
is
why they were sourced. But sorry, go ahead.
So they are, that is not that that's not true. But then when they come here, they have like that awakening moment of, gosh, this is actually a lot tougher than I thought it was going to be, because you may not be able to apply your expertise in your role in the same way because of the colleagues that you'll be working with, and you just maybe haven't done enough, as you say, been curious enough, motivated enough to learn about the different cultures that you're going to be working with, think about how that's going to impact the work that you do.
And also from an HR perspective, as we mentioned earlier today, they haven't been supported with their onboarding. They haven't been given that information to say, hey, dude, your team is going to be 5% of this culture, 5% of that culture. These are some hints and tips that we find that work best with dealing with, motivating, communicating to, instructing. And that's where a lot of people fail. They're like, I can't perform, I can't do this because my team don't listen. My team, and I'm sure if they, researched a little bit, that they would find it. HR needs to take a bit of that responsibility.
Yeah, that's a great point. I like the way that both of you are talking about. In some regards, the expectations have been poorly set from corporate that sent them in the first place. Either, hey, you're so good at this particular role, therefore we want you to help open our new office there. Or, to your point, not having explicitly said, do you understand what the makeup of our office looks like or is going to look like in Dubai or in the Middle East?
A lot of companies will do an employee handbook, and I work on these documents very regularly, and I had a conversation with somebody just this week, and I know we're only on Tuesday, about what needs to be included in the employee handbook, and does really all of this information need to be in there? And I'm looking at it from a perspective of people coming who maybe haven't had it before with another company, or haven't had are new to the UAE, and putting information in about this is the Emirati culture. This is what it means to be working in an Islamic Muslim culture, Ramadan, and all these things, which when you've lived here for a long time are basic, but we forget that for a lot of people, it's not basic. Even if you think, in the US and in the UK, I worked with Muslims. They never had a call to prayer, never once heard one in the middle of London. I had a Muslim GM who would do Ramadan every year, and I don't understand how he quite managed it, because the world didn't stop turning. Whereas here, it's accommodated, and that is something that I think a lot of companies miss, and that curiosity needs to be included.
So I'm curious, Sarah, you've lived in multiple places in the region. Do you also see some of that with people moving from one place in the Gulf to another of like, oh, I've already done
because so I've lived and worked in Kuwait, lived and worked in Oman, and lived and worked in the UAE, and I've visited relatively extensively in Saudi Arabia on holiday as well. And each of the GCC national cultures has their own identity and their own behaviours. They have their own language. They speak Arabic, but with nuances the same way as we would with English in the US and the UK. So there are very different cultural perspectives to it, and different ways of working and different habits and things like this. I remember in Kuwait, there was, this was many, many years ago, and I know things have moved on from them, but there was a lack of awareness of simple things, but things that we would take for granted, like somebody who's got epilepsy. Somebody had an epileptic fit in the office, and the response and reaction to it from the Kuwaiti colleagues was like something I'd never seen before. And I was the only person who could identify what this lady was going through.
Meaning, like, they didn't know what to do with it?
They didn't know what to do. The response was wailing, screaming, and praying. And I'm like, no, call the ambulance, do this, it's fine.
Go ahead and pray, but we're also going to take some action.
And not being disrespectful, and totally understand, but
Sure.
they were in shock and awe of me, because like, how do you know how to do this? And that was a cultural understanding between the two of us of like, okay, you don't know this, and this isn't part of your education, and I do know this, and it's part of mine and my awareness. And so they learned something that day and went, right, so we need to make sure that we know this about our team if anybody's got any critical medical issues, and what do we do if they have? So whilst at the time it was a little bit shock and awe, and it is one of those sort of GCC stories that you have, there was a learning point out of it that grew for both parties involved. Each of the, and I think the other thing to say about the interactions with the local individuals from each nationality, people have very different receptions. So I know of people who don't like Kuwaitis because of certain cultural behavioural traits that they have, whereas I have no problem at all because of my interactions with them, and vice versa with Saudis and things like this as well. But there is a very definitive cultural difference, and when you travel to them, even as a tourist, you can see and feel the differences. It's quite interesting.
I think that's part of what intrigues me so much about the work that we attempt to do in cultural intelligence, is it moves it beyond just this cognitive, the Kuwaitis are this way, the Brits are this way, but says we have an emotional reaction to some of these behaviors that happen. I think we need to be more honest, especially in the cultural and HR space, like not to justify it, but to say it's not abnormal if there's certain behaviors that chafe against you. So how do we actually have honest discussion?
To accept that, and that's
accept
okay.
it.
And I know, Emma, you have questions, otherwise I'll just keep talking.
Well, you've moved us nicely on, David, to talking about some of the other capabilities of cultural intelligence. So you've spoken about CQ Drive. In terms of CQ strategy, what are some of the things that leaders should be thinking about in terms of how they can strategize where, let's assume somebody has come new into the region and they're working with a multicultural team. What are some of the strategies that they should be applying to the work?
Yeah, I think part of it is first for them to do a bit of an assessment, whether it's actually using something like the cultural intelligence assessment or even just a qualitative one of seeking to understand first what is their familiarity with this cultural background. Because one of the worst things we can do is suddenly like talk down to people and give them training that they're like, actually I grew up some of my life in this part of the region or whatever. So taking time to personalize it based upon what's there. And then I think, so let me use a non-example and then push it forward as an example. So, many companies, and both you are familiar with this, will spend some time doing pre-departure training. Hey, before you go to the UAE, we want you to go through this one-day workshop on
and some of them
Emirati
don't
culture.
as well.
And some of them don't.
Actually, I go with the majority of them don't.
And I'm not surprised, especially now. Yeah. I've seen a lot of that get stripped away. But the part that we've found interesting in some of the research on it is even the ones that do, even if it was very well done, oftentimes, you both know, you're expats here, oftentimes like 4 weeks before you're moving abroad, the last thing on your mind is, so what is the Emirati approach to mental health and to an epileptic response? Like, where am I going to live? Where's my child going to go to school, et cetera? And so the ones that were more effective, and this comes to what can they proactively do by strategy, they actually found that a coaching approach after someone's been relocated, after they get here, now I have much more prime motivation for help me figure out what in the world happened in this meeting I was a part of yesterday. So now it's not so much this theoretical, like, okay, yeah, when I get there, but by the way, is my internet set up yet? I would say I keep linking back to drive and motivation, that even the strategy should be linked to, am I actually motivated? Oh, and the other thing I was going to say is, Emma, we were talking a little bit about one might come thinking, well, I was hired because I'm all that as a project manager or software engineer. And so because of that, the more that we can link the discussion about cultural behaviors specific to their role. Sometimes people in our space can be guilty of kind of lofty, let me teach you about Ramadan, and that, well, let me teach you about what it's going to be like to be in the workplace during Ramadan, specifically when you're trying to get a project done. Like the more we can link it to real life, practical behaviors. So that was all over the place.
No, that's fine.
And weigh in, because you have real life corporate experience here with learning and development. And
yeah, well, I was just thinking to the point you talked about in terms of people that are relocating here with the relocation coaching that I do. You often have an individual who's super confident about their capability, or say things like, oh yeah, I've been there on holiday, I know what Dubai's like. And I'm like, okay, and I don't try and convince them otherwise, because I just think you're super confident. What I'll do is wait till we do the post-arrival sessions where you're then frantic about you've had a revelation that you have no idea what to do, and now you need my support.
Why am I not living on a street of gold, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's where then, I try and help them think about, what strategies they can put in place.
I mean, sometimes I would say I'd much rather have someone who hasn't traveled a lot, who's sort of like, I don't have any clue what life is, as compared to the very well-traveled person who's kind of got that swagger of, I've holidayed all over the world, etc. And okay,
there's a big difference between being a tourist somewhere and being like an expat or a member of society, as it were. I mean, and even there's a judgment based on nationality. I mean, I remember many years ago, I worked with a gentleman who was British by passport. His mother was, can't remember, and his father was Egyptian. So he spoke Arabic, couldn't read or write it, and arrived in the region, and everybody assumed because he spoke Arabic.
Sure.
And I'm not just talking about and it wasn't me, because I've known him for 10, 15 years, but other people assumed that he would be able to read Arabic and write Arabic because he spoke it, but also that he was Muslim. So he understood what Ramadan was. So they didn't give him any training. He stood outside the office in Ramadan smoking a cigarette with taxi drivers yelling at him.
Wow.
I'm like, no, get back in.
I've seen a similar pattern where sometimes like American-born Chinese have a harder time assimilating into, say, an assignment in Hong Kong or right in China than maybe someone who looks like me, because there's expectations that are placed on them, and maybe on themselves too, of thinking like, I know this because I've grown up with it.
It's difficult. And I think there's part of that with the generations that are coming up here who have maybe got that familial heritage and culture, but they've also got the Dubai culture from growing up here and going to school here. Because, kids at school here, I went to a fairly international school in the UK, but over here you've got, your classroom's got 20 or 30 different nationalities in it, and you're spending 8-12 hours a day with them. So there's all of those sort of nuances that need to be thought about and considered, especially, bringing Gen Z into the workforce now as well, that they're not just a singular culture, if you like. You've got all of those nuances coming.
So we're seeing an increase of people talking about like, how do we future-proof skills, especially because there's an influx of globalization across the world, and AI changing the face of the workplace. So how do you believe that cultural intelligence will help future-proof people in the workplace in the future?
Yeah, obviously I'm biased, but even if you take my bias out of it, there tends to be a lot of shared alignment around the idea that cultural intelligence, or at least associated human skills, are becoming all the more important. That part of what really makes you stand apart in a world of AI is to have that. I think the piece too that I'm really struck by a lot is as we future-proof, we have increased complexity in the world of work. And, at least at the point of when we're recording this, we're in the midst of a massive trade war instigated largely from the US. And, I was talking to an executive yesterday who's like, every morning I wake up and try to figure out, what are the new regulations today that I need to factor in terms of how I do it? So cultural intelligence has to link beyond just the, people skills, but also very tangibly, like, am I applying my CQ strategy to anticipating some new regulation that might occur, et cetera. And then finally, I think even as you look at Saudi's Vision 2030, like part of what is really being focused on in terms of this whole future work development is, are we going to be a place that somehow figures out how we retain some of our cultural heritage and religious identity while also wanting to open ourselves up to the world? So
I think that's something that actually is interesting. When you do travel to the different GCC countries, you can see how different governments have retained that and maintained it. Saudi's actually doing a really fabulous job of retaining a lot of their culture and a lot of their heritage in terms of developing sites and things like their Lula and places like this, but also within the cities. And if you go to Oman, you can see it as well, even from the building construction. So there's no high-rise tower blocks in Oman. It's all 6 stories fixed, and they must have Islamic.
David just holidayed there recently, in fact.
So
I've holidayed there, so I know Oman.
So you know all of it. Yeah, exactly. You should know everything about the people.
At least knows the scenery is what I meant.
Exactly. But you've met the people. You can see, and they're keeping that culture and that heritage running through because of the urbanization.
Such a vast contrast when you go from Dubai to Muscat.
Exactly. And that again is something else, is that we were talking earlier, if people are moving between, everybody says, I can move anywhere in the GCC. Can you? Go from Kuwait to Dubai and go from Dubai to Oman and then back to Dubai again, because that's the reality of what I've done over the last 18 years. And you have to shift, or I used to do that.
Well, and quite literally, there was a period when I was working in the region when we were doing a lot of work in Doha, and as you know, I couldn't even get to Doha without first going to Oman from Dubai and then on. Yeah. So that the literal movement from one place to another gets impacted by the country-specific differences too.
I've had people inquire with me about cultural intelligence training for employees in Saudi, but expat employees in Saudi. And then they said, so I assume this is just for the expats that will be joining the team. And I was like, no. It would also be valuable to do this training as well with your Saudi nationals too, because we're trying to kind of change the culture in Saudi. As you've said, it's evident that Saudi is doing its level best to make sure it retains its own culture. But I think that you can't have half the team being able to apply CQ strategy and the other teams say, and this is how we are, and you'll have to accept us.
That's a super important point. Even more broadly with cultural intelligence, is if it's not reciprocal, then you can work as hard as you can to adapt to the different behaviors, but at some level, there has to be some kind of give and take between the two. So I think that's a really valid point.
Yes.
And I think that you've been doing a lot about recently the kind of vertical line of cultural intelligence in terms of, and whose role is it to perhaps initiate the flex? Right. I don't know if you wanted to kind of just touch on that.
Yeah. So, in a neutral environment where it's just like, oh, you're more direct and I'm indirect, or you're more time oriented, I'm not, we would typically say, well, the person who has higher cultural intelligence, the onus is on them to adapt. But to your point, we've been looking more at, but how does cultural intelligence apply when there's a status difference or a power difference? And that is where I would say the person with more power has the responsibility to do the majority of adapting. And that's an interesting example of what you're just saying, that the locals that are receiving, to what degree is the onus on them to actually play a role in adapting? And I'm not necessarily assuming that the locals always have the most status. There may be times when it's a Western company and that it might be the predominant power, at least organizationally, is far more from expats. So they might be the ones that have to do more adapting. I think it's a fascinating conversation in this part of the world when you just look at some of the stratification of different cultural groups and how that plays itself out, which is probably a deeper issue than we want to get into today. But the point being that it's not just as simple as different communication styles or work styles. It's also, there's always somebody with more status in any conversation.
And you've got a lot of nuances around what makes somebody the way they are. And I know that that is what cultural intelligence is, but around looking at the religions and what one person's perception of somebody else's religion might be and how that interacts also builds into how people behave with each other. And one of the challenges and we briefly spoke about it before we started recording, but that I've noticed is that there is an automated, and I'm going to use the D word, discriminatory behaviour towards certain nationalities because of certain behaviours. How can we approach that from an HR perspective to say, okay, so they happen to have an X passport, but it doesn't mean they're going to behave like Y. How can we accommodate that?
I think one very tactical way is using something like a cultural values assessment. What's the name of yours?
Cultural Vantage.
Culture Vantage. And so, an activity that we often do with that is you have groups take one of these inventories and then they map where their team is on them. And the way that I think that sometimes helps is you start to see how you yourself are often an anomaly to your culture of origin. I'm clearly Anglo, but there are aspects of my culture map that doesn't look very Anglo. And so it helps them start to see, you can't assume that all Saudis are going to be a certain way or all Lebanese. So that's the first step. But then I think as we really start to move through cultural intelligence and talking about things like suspending judgment, even exercises like what's something people assume to be true about you that's not actually accurate at all, and getting them to go, well, don't you also think that's probably true of all the people that you're interacting with? So, those are.
But also, I think also some of the language that we maybe use. I think sometimes when we see something where somebody behaves in a way that is not typical to what we might expect, you often talk about weird and it depends.
Right,
so tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. So, we spent a number of years in Singapore when our kids were really young. And even from a very early age, when, one of my daughters would be like, that's weird. They're carrying an umbrella and the sun is out. And I'm like, no, not weird. It's different, or not wrong, different. I mean, and eventually, there may be times where we're like, well, there may be something immoral that's going on in a situation. So, I was just going to say something else on it depends, but I lost it. So, no, I was going to say where I thought you were actually going to go with that, Emma, is the cultural values also give language for things that is not value laden, but just descriptive. So for example, sometimes when I'm describing direct versus indirect communication, I will often have a Western direct communicator is like, oh, so indirect is passive aggressive, right? I'm like, well, it could be passive aggressive, but you could also be direct and be passive aggressive. So let's talk about it as a neutral communication difference. So I think that's a piece where trying to get people to be like, that behavior doesn't necessarily have to mean someone's being passive aggressive or rude or blunt or whatever else it might be. Maybe blunt, but rude, not necessarily.
Yeah. Blunt and direct. That should be our tagline.
Sarah, you were mentioning religion, and I don't know how both of you would feel about this, but one thing that I actually find refreshing about the workplace in this region is it feels like there is more open discussion about religion as part of the diversity conversation, which I think we've talked about this. The UK, the US, it's like, don't talk about religion. Like that's.
So I'm a practicing Christian, and if I was to say that to my colleagues in the UK, they would look at me like I've got two heads, and they would also then follow that with, and you go to church every week. And so there's that kind of whole, like that weird,
but you
you're
seem
weird.
normal.
You're normal.
Yeah.
Whereas in this region, if you kind of discuss the fact that you follow a particular faith, it doesn't get that view, and it's quite normalized. It's like, oh, okay, yeah. And then we move on to the next topic. So I think that's, for me, quite refreshing in this region that we do, kind of have the freedom to, follow a faith as long as, we're tolerant of every person.
And it's one of the nice things about the region. It's so tolerant of so many different faiths as well. And that's indicative of all of the different religious buildings that have been constructed in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi. And there's some absolutely amazing structures, really stunningly beautiful. That even as somebody who's not a religious person would go, I want to go and visit that because it looks like an amazing building, and just that accommodation of the different religions is there. I mean, obviously from a legal, governmental perspective, everything is Islamic faith, Sharia law is that underpins everything that's decided. But there are those acknowledgements of Holi, it get, for that gets the Festival of Lights and things like this that get covered. Easter gets covered. More and more over the years. There's more I would say westernization.
Yeah,
There's more
I've been surprised to see a lot of Easter themed stuff this week when I'm here. And
it's
Easter's
crazy. But then you've also got changes in like Christmas, for example. The Christmas lights. I mean, I remember. So my parents lived in Abu Dhabi for a while. And I remember them not having Christmas lights up until a certain time because of when Eid fell or the National Day weekend. They couldn't put the Christmas festive lights up until after the lights for that had been taken down because they didn't want to associate the two events, which completely
understandable, yeah.
Respectful, not a problem at all. Whereas now things seem to be melding a little bit more.
Well, and you mentioned that the Christmas markets have gone all out in Dubai now, which I never would have
imagined. Coming. Oh, there's Easter markets at Expo now.
Wow.
Yeah. I think one of the things that talking about when people come into the region, one of the things that they are quite surprised about is about things like the holidays. So if they're coming from the UK, I don't get Easter now, or I don't get Christmas Day off. I'm like, well, no, not naturally. It might be something that your company chooses to allow you to have, but it's not something that you will naturally get as a given. And when you then also try and explain that you also won't know necessarily what your public holidays days are going to be because it's all based on the moon sighting. And again, people that come from countries that maybe don't follow.
That's wrong, or that's weird.
Or just like, what do you mean? I won't know if I've got the day off until the day before.
12 hours before.
And like, yes, that's how it goes here. But
fly by the seat of your pants on that one.
Just so there is a shift there in terms of getting used to those sort of differences. Yeah,
no, definitely. And that's part of that cultural education of, this is where you're living and how these things work together. And it's something that needs to be better educated from an HR perspective, absolutely.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time, but maybe you could just leave us with one answer. But my question earlier was around future-proofing at work, but what's one kind of thing that you'd like to leave our listeners with in terms of what they should be thinking about for cultural intelligence and the future place of work, basically?
Yeah. So in one way, this probably sounds overly simplistic, but I'm surprised by how often people overlook it. And that's just to see the power of the culture effect on everything that we do. And so I think I would just encourage people to go throughout the next 10 hours and just look for culture everywhere. How is culture affecting what people are wearing right now? Who's interacting with whom? What advertisement is being used and how that reflects it. So just starting to get the cultural lens on, and whether that means you're working in this region as an expat or you're somebody anywhere around the world. I know your podcast has a global reach, to just begin to have the cultural lens on and to see that it isn't the only thing. There are other things that affect behavior and affects what's going on, but to step back and go, how much of this is a cultural kind of situation that's happening here. So thank you to you both. I have watched the CQHR podcast, and it was a delight to be part of the summit earlier today, the first one that's here, and just really grateful for the work that you're both doing. And Emma, as I said earlier at the summit, you are the leading voice of cultural intelligence in the region. And so it's a joy to see the way that cultural intelligence is really expanding here in the UAE and across the Gulf through the work that both of you are doing together.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
And hopefully next time you're back, we can have you again for a bit more in-depth conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Much.